Welcome. It is Tuesday, 7:40 p.m., and you are joining us here on Pump Up the Volume. I'm Dr. Luis Daniel Munoz, and I'm have the privilege today of again being here with all of my co-hosts. We know that we had a few missing over the past couple of weeks, but we're here with Mr. Bill Bartholomew from the Bartholomew Town Podcast. It's great to have you as a co-host, Bill. We're here with Mr. Roberto Gonzalez from Steambox, Rhode Island. Great to have Roberto back on. And of course, Mr. Pat Ford, founder of the Coalition Radio Network, and again, one of my fellow co-hosts. In terms of my background, before I present our special guest, as you may all know, I am, again, a medical doctor, previous independent gubernatorial candidate here in the state of Rhode Island, and someone who really believes that communities should better understand what is going on in the political establishment, what are the grassroots efforts that are taking place here in Rhode Island, and how all of those different things, policies, ideas, programs can impact your life. And with the things that I don't know, my fellow co-host as well as our guest are able to fill in those areas for you. So today we do have a special guest. She agreed to come on the show before she knew that she would be state senator-elect. So we, again, are very grateful to have her. We have Miss Tiara Mack. And again, thank you so much for joining us. Congratulations on your great campaign. And we are looking forward to seeing things that you'll do in office. So Tiara, we know that today's call may be relatively short. We do have a little bit of a later start here, but I think everyone is really just interested in learning more about you, a little bit about your background, like what brought you to this point in life, and what's your vision for Rhode Island and moving forward. So I'll just open up the floor and let you take the lead.
Cool. Well, it's hard describing a not quite so linear journey that involved like no GPS, no almanacs, no atlases. I don't know what you used to use before, like MapQuest, but none of those were involved in the journey to get where I am here. But I think it is a culmination of growing up as a low-income person in the South, going and having the opportunity to go to an Ivy League university, being a Black teacher at a low-income school in Massachusetts, being a youth worker, and being a reproductive justice advocate, that all culminated in the experience and the confidence to run for office.
Awesome. So thank you so much for sharing that. And so you pointed to a lot, right? There are a lot of different layers to that, and coming forward, I mean, was there a tipping point, right? Was there a thing that really pushed you to make that decision? And having run for office, I know it's not an easy decision to make, and frankly, it almost feels probably like you're making it every single day on the campaign, right? Should I continue? So was there a thing that really led you to say, now is the time to run?
Yeah. So I started working on my first legislative race in Rhode Island in 2014 as an intern through Planned Parenthood of Rhode Island. And that was when I saw that a lot of our politicians were very similar to the ones I grew up with in the conservative Christian South, backed by the right to life, didn't believe in a lot of the social progressive movements that at a school like Brown, we were taught to value all of these quote unquote leftist ideas. And it wasn't until I was on the front lines for the fight for the RPA last year, which finally passed after years and years of never making it to the floor for a vote, that I realized that those fights, those grassroots fights that start with years and years of people on the ground, on the front lines, needs more people like that. Being one of the only Black people in the State House advocating for something that affects so many people who look like me, so many of my students, so many of my young people, and so many communities that are people of color, that are historically marginalized, that are formerly low income or low income people, was kind of the catalyst for me. I'm like, why aren't there more stories like this in the State House? Why aren't there more people who look like me standing in the State House demanding more of our government, of our state government, of our elected officials? And so that to me was the call. It's like, well, why not me? I am sitting in front of committees, I'm testifying, I'm going up to the State House 2-3 times a week, and there is no movement. They're not hearing the stories. They're not hearing the narratives of people who are spending the time going from one job to another, to the state house, leaving their kids, bringing their kids, eating dinner, sleeping on the leather couches, who are just dying to have their voices and their rights understood. And so it made me think, well, why not someone who knows those stories? Why not someone who has that story? Why not someone like me? Instead of taking it from the front lines, why not be one of the key decision makers who decides whether or not our rights are heard in policy?
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. So I do want to allow each of my hosts to ask a question and to better understand some your vision and the layers to that vision. But before we get there, I'm always interested in this question, so I do want to delicately ask it. But I think on the show we have really tried to understand the spectrum of what progressivism means, and really how it's implemented in practice, because we obviously see that in some instances there are litmus tests that are set up. In other instances, there are no litmus tests, and it's really more about achieving really an end independent of the multiple pathways that can take you to that end. So from your perspective, in terms of your definition of progressivism and what you stand for, might you be willing to share some of that?
Yeah, I think progressivism is the bold, audacious dream that we can create worlds and communities that look like nothing we've ever seen. And I think it's that audacious hope that comes from myself. I identify as a avid fantasy sci-fi fanatic. Love a good trilogy, love a good saga, and I think seeing worlds, especially Afrofuturism, it is all founded on this idea that we can create worlds that look differently than the reality that we exist now. And yes, they happen in the future in some cases, some made up stories, but they're also worlds that are so much more grounded in reality, grounded in justice, grounded in truth, grounded in liberation from societal structures that oppress and that tell people that they are not equal. So why can't we create those worlds right here? We're so used to having a society that works on such a rigid structure. Like, you have to do it this way, this happens. And laws are not neutral. They are made by people who have their own interest. We need to make sure that we're working, and no matter who is in charge, that we're making laws that literally work regardless of whether or not the people are good or not. We can create neutral laws that allow societies to function. And I think, as someone who loves sci-fi and fantasy, those are kind of what I look to. Like, we can create those worlds. It doesn't have to follow the same script. We can break the mold. And why not try the new and brave, audacious thing while we have it? And why can't that new, brave, audacious thing also be founded in justice and liberation for all people, and our understanding of anti-Blackness as it seeps into things like immigration, as it seeps into things like misogyny, as it seeps into things like as Islamophobia, anti-Semitism? Why can't we understand anti-Blackness as an issue that we need to all try to liberate from in every single aspect of our policies? I think that's what progressivism is seeing the world that could be and not the world that is, and seeing policies that could be and not that are. We don't need to reform, we need to rebuild, like break it down, rebuild.
Also, thank you so much for sharing that. And I will say, out of the many different definitions across the spectrum, I feel like that sounded very inclusive. And I think that is what is important, to create that new world, right? To really bring everyone together and to understand that there are multiple paths towards achieving that end. So awesome. Thank you so much. I could hog the mic all day, but I'm going to go ahead and see if Bill, you'd like to lead the next question.
Wow. Well, first of all, congratulations, ostensibly Senator-elect Mac. That's fun.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Obviously, people who follow along with my show, Bartholomew Town, you've been on, I think, 3 times, which is a lot. Probably Dr. Munoz is the only other person who's been on that often, really. No offense, Roberto and Pat, but it's been interesting to watch, because I've been really fascinated not only by your efforts and supportive from a philosophical standpoint. I don't think that's too unknown that I believe in your message, and my views align with that, but also the nuance of you were going against someone that I characterized frequently as a religious fanatic, someone who really was engaged in some hateful actions up at the State House, and just really, in my opinion, cluelessness, but also someone who was entrenched as a member of the establishment politics Yet, to the not careful observer on an identity politics level, there were some overlaps with you. How were you able to overcome the entrenched aspect of it, and frankly, all those things I mentioned? Because there are probably some people out there, I'm sure, that identify with the sort of religious fanaticism that outgoing Senator Metz possesses and espoused.
Yeah, well, wait, am I frozen? Okay, I'm back. Um, I had to keep reminding myself, like, and people, I'm like, y'all, remember, I'm Black too. I had so many people say, like, why are you challenging the only seated Black senator in the state? Like, I'm like, did I miss the memo? Did like I just like wake up and all of a sudden not become Black? And so I think that was
Right.
also a really hard conversation to have with people, because when there are so few people who are representative of a community, it's really hard to see them quote unquote pitted against each other. And it is no secret that folks in Rhode Island are not tuned into local politics. We had our highest record of voters in a primary election, 11.4%. Like, that's crazy. Like, literally no one's tapped into these. No one's paying attention to the local politics. No one's paying attention to someone who, for the last 30 of 35 years, was making policies that were steeped in homophobia, misogyny, and a host of other things, anti-immigrant sentiment, and a host of other things that just weren't emblematic of the communities that he was serving. But because he is a Black man that was entrenched, many people went to schools where he taught at, where he was their principal, he was a coach, he was a deacon at one of the oldest Black churches. They see that and they often conflate that with who he is and what he can do in a political office. And I think that's why it's so hard to separate the personal from the political. And the personal is always political. Like, if those are your personal ideas, then you're going to carry that into your politics. And it's really hard for some people to reckon with that. We know that this is someone that you know personally, on a personal level, that you have a personal relationship, and that his personal relationship doesn't carry over to larger communities and doesn't involve inclusivity. So I think I was battling a lot of that. Also being significantly younger, there's a lot of different factors. I'm openly queer. Some people have said that I'm pitting the Blackness against the Black agenda against the queer agenda, and I'm like, we've got agendas now. So it's definitely been a lot of reflective practice for me to like stick with my core convictions. I know why I decided to run. I know what battles I'm here to fight, and I know what policies I'm bringing that are going to be steeped in inclusivity. And that's not to say that for some people in the community, that has not had some policies that represented their communities, that made them feel seen, made them feel included in Rhode Island politics. But there's also a whole community out there that feel like they have not had that voice for over 14 years while he was senator, and 16 years while he was a state rep.
Thank you.
My turn?
Okay, Pat, but remember, Roberto has to go too. So, all right. Okay.
Well, my questions are actually going to be uncharacteristically brief. As the second woman elected to high office in the state of Rhode Island who has actually played rugby, I'd like to know the position you played. It is the greatest sport ever invented. And will you be having rugby conversations with our governor? More importantly, though, on a serious note, in this state right now, the Commerce Corporation exists allegedly to provide information, financial support for economic development for all Rhode Islanders. I think we all know in this room the reality. So when you talk about economic development and you talk about, which of course is a dog whistle for gentrification, from your personal philosophy, from your studies, from your life as an activist, and now your newfound life as a state senator, should economic development be to the benefit of those, in some cases, multi-generational families and perhaps newer arrivals to this country and to our neighborhood? Should it be their benefit, or should economic development be to bring in outsiders, bring in outside investment at very often the direct expense of the community?
I feel like that last one was a leading question, but I'll start with rugby. Yes, I did know that Governor Raimondo also played rugby. When Brown became a varsity sport my junior year, she was invited to come and like welcome our team into like the varsity world. But I am was a longtime lock at Brown. Moved into prop and most recently have been aiding, and fingers crossed when COVID restrictions lift, I plan to still play rugby when I'm a senator, probably a little bit less full time, but I plan on playing rugby until my body and bones are literally like, please stop.
Excellent.
Yeah, and then in terms of economic opportunities, I think has often been a misnomer with our economic growth. I can't remember the exact word you said, but it doesn't often include people who look like us. And I don't follow too closely the Rhode Island Black Business Association, but they've been left out of so many different economic advancements that are happening right here in Rhode Island. We have the Rhode Island Black Business Association that isn't written into any municipal law, isn't written into state law. These are our Black business owners who've been historically disenfranchised from business ownership, from home ownership, and from wealth advantages in our communities. Who are we actually investing in? I think that is a testament to how far we have to go in uplifting the idea of economic justice, overhauling the generational wealth gap that exists between Black and Brown folks in our communities. And then also Rhode Island, we are falling significantly behind our neighboring states because we don't invest in industry right here. We don't invest in people. We have a host of young people who are fleeing the state because there are not economic opportunities for jobs, for career options, for growth, for housing. So why stay in a state where you're continuing to see your families, your aunts or uncles priced out of their homes? You don't see any job opportunities in the state. So I think it's time that we really reflect on what are we actually investing in for economic growth right here in our state. Are we investing in a Green New Deal for green new jobs that's going to expand the opportunities for folks who want to stay in Rhode Island? Good union jobs, good green jobs. Are we investing in communities and not just gentrifying the heck out of the east side, the west end, so that we have those commuters from Boston moving in? Are we going to have longevity of families whose I think one of the most beautiful things about when I was walking in the neighborhoods, like some people could literally point out the generations of families that have lived in a home or they had that home passed down from an aunt, an uncle, a parent, and you can't do that anymore. A lot of those homes no longer belong to them, and yeah, I think that is what we need to start paying attention to. Like, who are these opportunities for, and what are we actually investing in our state? And can we stop falling behind in New England? And can we start being the model laboratory state for national conversations of if Rhode Island's 1.5 million people can get this done, and this small, densely populated state, it can be done anywhere. We should be a model state for how we implement policies that work on justice and liberation for our people.
That's outstanding. I look forward to having a conversation with you offline at some point. The government of the state of Rhode Island essentially announced yesterday that the a soccer stadium combined with luxury housing and high-end retail will effectively crowd out yet another neighborhood in Pawtucket. It will probably fail on a financial basis, and incredibly enough, in a state that professes to be progressive, it is going to use a Trump administration tax scam to reward selected investors who will essentially profit from a neighborhood in Pawtucket being deemed blighted. To me, that is disgusting. So I look forward to your tenure as a senator here in the state.
Thanks so much, Pat. So Roberto, would you like to introduce a question?
Hi, Senator Mack. In a year of grief here on Pump Up the Volume, the four of us get together and we are frustrated because we are warriors and we are fighting for our community. So it feels really nice to come into one of these Pump Up the Volume episodes and celebrate. I'm very excited about your victory. I have a lot of reasons that I probably don't even want to get into on air. But I'm wondering if you even know that over the past few weeks, you and I are slightly becoming best friends. Which is really cool. I really appreciate that. Again, I want to congratulate you. And since you and I both have a background in education, what I'm wondering is, how are you going to use your platform? Do you have specific goals or an agenda for education, specifically locally here in Rhode Island?
Yes, lots of ideas for education. One, Y'all, do you know how many different districts there are in Rhode Island? There are like 36 different districts. We have 39 different counties, or 39 different cities. Like, but why? Some of our districts, our entire state is honestly the size of some districts to the south. Texas has districts larger than our entire state. Think about the allocation of resources that we are literally we're literally distributing to higher positions and not into our education. We can break down those systems and have one, more funding for our schools, more funding for our young people, and we can also break down the silos that exist between all 36 of those different school districts. And I think it also is really important to know that reciprocity needs to become like an ASAP thing. I am an educator. I have my license. I have my license to teach in Massachusetts, and I was living in Providence at the time. And when I tried to move to Rhode Island to teach high school math, I could not because my license is in Massachusetts. There's no reciprocity. I would have had to get emergency certification, go back to school, take classes at Rick or URI, and it would have been like a 5-year process. And I'm like, and I would have also gotten a pay cut. And I'm like, I'm a Black, bilingual, queer secondary math teacher. Y'all don't want me? Like, y'all are just like screaming for me to come to your schools. And so it was easier for me to become an administrator become an administrator in a charter school than to stay in the public school field, where my mom's a public school teacher. I had been in a public school in Massachusetts for 2 years and wanted to be in a public school, but it wasn't a reality. We also don't have teachers that look like our students. We need more Black and brown teachers. We need to have a pathway for our students in middle schools and high schools who see themselves as educators getting into post-secondary education programs to become teachers that then go back into their schools, who know the culture, who know the kids, who know the neighborhoods, who know the families, and then become those teachers that our young people can look up to. Right now, we're importing talent from communities and neighborhoods that don't look like our students. They don't understand our students. They don't know how to teach in an urban environment. We aren't giving them tools to teach in an urban environment, and our kids are suffering because of it. And there's just so many different factors that could be addressed if we had people who are actually interested in quality education. And I think it's also a shame that Rhode Island has like what Johns Hopkins being one of the worst education systems in our country. Like, I grew up in South Carolina where there's the corridor of shame, which you would think that the corridor of shame is worse than Providence public schools, but according to Johns Hopkins is not. And we're literally 20 minutes away from one of the best education systems in the nation in Massachusetts. Why is it that we can cross the border in 20 minutes and get a significantly better education? You have families who, if they have the means, they don't send their kids to public schools. They send them straight to private schools because they know that the quality of education their kids is going to get is not going to be worth it. And that's been the case for from families I've heard of who've been here for years. It's been the case for if not 20 years, if not longer. So when are we going to take a step back and say that we need to do better by our young people? We need to do better by our education. And it starts with addressing some of the glaring problems first, and then by addressing some of like the smaller systemic issues. But 36 different school districts in Rhode Island, y'all, no.
Clearly, it's a well thought out answer, because that's something that we've talked about on this show before, is all of them becoming potentially one district and the equity that would follow, which is why I would expect a lot of resistance. Thank you so much for your answer, Dr. Munoz.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question, Roberto, as well. So if possible, I'd love to have two final questions. One, it is kind of specific to policy and kind of methodology around how you think about implementing policy. And then then we'll have a final question really to help you kind of summarize your vision for the future. And so one question, I will note though, I was a wingman in the rugby club at Rhode Island College, so totally love rugby.
Wow.
Wingman is the safest position, so I have to say that though. So I wasn't in the rough with the fullbacks and all. But to my question, when I think of progressive policies around healthcare, I have always struggled with the litmus test around that. So for instance, single payer systems. I do believe that there are single payer systems in some countries, like Israel in particular, that are very interesting, that have an interesting model around public options. They are truly a hybrid system as compared to what we have tried to create here in the US. And then there's something different in Germany, and then there's something different in Japan. So when I look at the proposal for healthcare for all, my issue has never been with the mission and the values around that. certainly not. My concern has always been that if there is not an appropriate plan that considers the sustainability of a program in terms of the finances, then that program could crumble. And if it crumbles, the communities that will be mostly impacted initially will be poor communities that are already negatively impacted by a failed community health system here in the state of Rhode Island and throughout the U.S. And so I'm prefacing my question with the background and where I'm coming from, so that you can kind of understand that I'm not trying to undermine the progressive mission or what might have been presented as one around healthcare, but I'm interested in knowing from your perspective, when you think about healthcare and when you think about everything else and you see this ideal that we hope to achieve, what is your strategy and what is your kind of methodology around implementing that policy and strategy? And is fiscal responsibility an element of your thinking? I know that there are probably 3 questions in there, but I'm just hoping that you might be able to touch on the multiple facets of what that means for you.
Yeah, I think I don't know if I'm going to answer this outright, but I will say that you brought up those 3 different countries, Israel, Germany, and Japan. And yes, they all have different systems. And if you look at those countries and their cultural backgrounds, some are individualistic countries, some are collectivist societies, and some have a religious-based doctrine. And the US is kind of like a hodgepodge of all of those. And I think that's why single payer is so hard of a moral issue, of a philosophical issue to tackle right here in the United States, because we have hyper individualistic societies, we have some collectivist communities, we have some people who see it as a moral issue, some people who see it as a philosophical issue, some who see it as an existential crisis of our generation. And there's so many different ways that you can attack the issue of healthcare. And I think that's what's preventing a solid solution from coming to the forefront, because we don't know which should we address first. Should we address the philosophy of everyone having healthcare as a human right? Should we address that there should be multiple options? If we have a single payer, should there also be private options? Because it's America. There are going to be some people who are not going to be okay and who are going to fight the system as hard as they can from the inside, from the outside, if there is not a private option, which they can directly and their family can directly benefit more from if there was a public option. And so I think that's the biggest beast to kind of tackle. No matter how solid of a plan we make, there are going to be the naysayers who are actively working against that system because it's not what they wanted. And that's how politics has worked all along. If someone doesn't like something, they will work their hardest against it to make sure that it crumbles, or give it a misnomer of a name to make sure that people immediately hate it as soon as they hear it. Like affordable health care became Obamacare. Same thing, but people have a whole different outlook when they hear affordable healthcare. Like, yeah, I want affordable healthcare. And then when they hear Obamacare, they're like, no, we don't want that. Like, he's not really like our guy. So I think that's the biggest issue about healthcare, that I think is it's kind of the philosophical and moral dilemma that we have to get to from a policy side. Are we going to be able to appease both sides? Is it morally worth appeasing the side that wants a private option, or should we just push forward ahead with a fully public option, knowing that there's going to be resistance and potentially a collapse of the system from the people who are going to be fighting it so hard? And those are some of the things that keep me up at night too.
I mean, do you err on the side of pragmatism as long as it's within the boundaries of your value system? Or do you err on the side of idealism, independent of whether a path is very clear, a practical path is clear? And I'm not saying that there's a wrong answer here. And more so, these are steps. I'm just trying to figure out what's your order of steps when you move towards something.
Good question. Way to make me answer it. I don't think I'm too much of a pragmatist. I think I'm definitely an idealist. And I think we can have a system that works for the vast majority of people. And I'm also a firm believer in that inequity has existed for far too long, and we are going to need to do radical changes in order to adjust the scale to equality. And even if that means like some people who are all the way, who are all the way up here start to feel like they're like sinking, but we need to get everyone on a place to where healthcare is a reality and a human right for every single person in our country. And if that means going to a fully publicly funded option for everyone, so be it. Does that mean we're going to have a lot of big fights along the way and during the whole process and like justify it? I think those fights would be worth it if we are making sure that literally everyone has access to healthcare. I don't believe in private options. Like, I just don't see the need for some people to have better access to a service when we are all equally deserving of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And if you are entitled to more options, we are inherently saying that your value is more than someone else, and you are living in a way that deserves more than someone else based on advantages that you have in a society that was already stacked up against hundreds of thousands of people who don't have the advantages, either based on their zip code, their race, creed, religion, immigration status, parents, economic mobility, and a host of other issues.
Well, thank you so much for answering that. The reality is, right, even doctors, a doctor can actually be bound by non-compete in a health system where they can't work for another health system, whereas a lawyer can never be bound by non-compete. And that's because in the Constitution, healthcare is not a right versus legal representation is. So there's an interesting dynamic in this country, right, where we have created certain restraints, even to those that are on the front line. So thank you so much for answering that. I do think it's important to have both those worlds come together in terms of idealism and really finding a path. So that's to my last question here. As an idealist, could you create a scenario where you tell us what one policy you really want to focus on in the first 3 months, 6 months of your time in office? And then what you envision will manifest from that one policy 10 years out. So that's a little sci-fi-ish there, but I'm really interested because people that think like creatively, and I think we all are around the table, sometimes we create these worlds in our mind and try to see how one ripple will lead to some extraordinary change. So what is that ripple for you, and what is the world that you'll see in 10 years for it?
Oh, what an exciting question. And at first I hate that question. Like, what's the first thing you want to work on? I'm like, don't ask me that. There's too many. But I think if there's one thing that I could focus on, I think it is, oh gosh, it's so hard to think about where the ripples take us. I want to say environmental justice because there's so many beautiful ripples that can come from getting communities onto a smart grid, getting every single community, school, parking lot on a solar panel, wind energy, hydraulic power, and that we're reinvesting money in the community. Imagine all of the money families are saving over decades, over generations, 10 years down the line when you're generating more energy and you're able to sell it to outside states, to your neighbors, rather than spending hundreds of dollars on energy every single month. Imagine the money that stays in people's pockets. Imagine the wealth that we are able to keep in people's hands. Imagine buildings that are community run, community gardens in every single neighborhood. You're only 5 minutes away from a community garden where you're able to grow your fresh produce. Families no longer have to worry about their young children getting an asthma attack and staying out of school or paying thousands of dollars in emergency room visits. That's, again, money in people's pockets that trickles down into educational advances. Students are no longer missing out on days and weeks of school because of an asthma attack. Families who are not missing out on thousands of dollars because of emergency room visits. Communities that no longer have the highest rates of asthma, which causes so many other things. We have a port that is not overly developed, and we can actually use that for green spaces. There's more recreation for our young people. So they're no longer in the streets. They're no longer being quote unquote problems, but they have bike paths that lead to some of their favorite hangout locations that are safe and child friendly, recreation communities in every single neighborhood. And that all starts with this idea that we can create environments and justice within environments where people live and breathe. And we're not pricing people out. These are communities where people are currently living, and we are not increasing the prices because they have solar power, because they have access to a bike path, or because they have access to a waterway or to a beautiful landscape. We're keeping the prices the same because of where these communities have been. And we're creating sustainable long-term communities that maintain their own wealth, that have their own flavor, their own feel, community gardens, quality life, great education. And I think that's like some of the most exciting things to think about, like the propagation of when you do something so little as giving people solar panels, that it turns into wealth creation, it turns into sustainability, it turns into better health outcomes, it turns into more recreation, it turns into healthier lifestyles. And I think that's like the most beautiful and exciting thing.
Well, that is a beautiful world. So I am so glad that with that world in mind, that vision. Yeah. So, I do want to say thank you so much State Senator, for coming on the show and for sharing your perspective. I just want to say you have been, I believe, transparent. You have shared your logic stream, the way you think, the way, what you're passionate about and why you're passionate about it. My hope is that our listeners will feel the same way we feel, which is, very hopeful and very confident about where we're going in the state. So hopefully you'll join us again here on Pump Up the Volume and share all the great stuff you're doing as you're doing it. We will be here continuing the fight in our own way, obviously, and trying to amplify the voices of community and of community leaders and elected officials like yourself that are really fighting the good fight. So on behalf of all of my co-hosts and our audience, thank you so much again. You ended it with something so amazingly beautiful and hopeful that my hope is that the viewers and the listeners will just take that with them and be inspired to do more. So thank you again. Hope you have a good evening. We'll talk soon, everyone. Thank you, co-host. Thank you, Roberto. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Pat, State Senator. All right. Join us next week here on Pump Up the Volume. Thanks, Steve.